I have promised to conduct the inquiry as openly as possible, and I am doing so, publishing large quantities of previously confidential information about decision-making during the pandemic on the inquiry website. This material and these proceedings give the media much on which to report. It only assists those who, unlike the inquiry, which investigates independently, have an agenda to pursue for this material to be shared before the inquiry has published it. I am conscious that we'll start hearing from high-profile and important witnesses in the coming days, and there will be much understandable speculation about what these witnesses will say. I ask all court participants and witnesses with access to such material to continue to respect the terms on which it has been shared with them, so that we can all hear what they say at the same time and fully, without gloss, partiality, and in a proper context. Thank you. Mr. Keith.
My lady, the first witness this morning is Martin Reynolds. Could you be sworn, please?
I swear by Almighty God that the evidence I shall give shall be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth.
Could you commence your evidence to this inquiry, please, by giving us your full name?
It's Martin Alexander Bailey Reynolds.
Mr. Reynolds, you were the former principal private secretary to the then Prime Minister Boris Johnson, were you not?
I was, yes.
You have provided a witness statement dated the 22nd of May 2023, a copy of which is on the screen, and I think you have signed that statement with the usual declaration on the last page, page 23. Thank you for your assistance in providing that to us. You joined the civil service in the late 1990s, did you not?
I did, yes.
I think you'd worked before as a lawyer in a city law firm. Did you begin your civil service career at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office?
I did, yes.
Between December 2014 and January 2018, were you the principal private secretary, the PPS, to the then Foreign Secretary, initially Philip Hammond, and then from July 2016, Boris Johnson?
That is correct.
When Mr. Johnson was appointed Prime Minister in July 2019, did he request you to return to London in order to be a private secretary or principal private secretary to him?
Yes, he did.
And therefore, did you work with him from July 2019 onwards?
Yes, I did.
And when did you become principal private secretary?
I believe it was in either October or November of the same year.
And did you remain Mr. Johnson's principal private secretary until mid-February 2022?
That is correct, yes.
I'd like to start your evidence, Mr. Reynolds, please, with some questions about the retention of emails and WhatsApps, given your role as the principal private secretary. Do you recall whether there was a policy in Downing Street in or around the first half of 2021 concerning whether emails should be retained, how they should be accumulated, how they should be archived, and so on?
Yes, I believe that emails relating, or non-ephemeral emails relating to decision-making processes were retained.
And for the purposes of this inquiry, were you therefore given access to emails which you sent and received in the course of your work in Downing Street, which were then put onto a laptop and allowing you to review them?
That is correct, although I think because of the nature of the IT systems, I think I only mainly saw emails which I had sent. So I don't think I saw the full comprehensive set of emails.
In his witness statement, Mr. Cummings and you're obviously aware who Mr. Cummings is, says that in the spring of 2020, so at some point after the commencement of the pandemic, he'd asked the Cabinet Office to ensure that number 10 email accounts were saved for a future lessons learned exercise. Do you recall anything about that and whether or not there was a debate about saving emails for a lessons learned exercise?
I don't, but I believe emails were retained in the normal way under our normal policies.
Simon Case, who was Cabinet Secretary and remains Cabinet Secretary, says in his statement that in March 2021, a number 10 policy on WhatsApps was established. Do you recall anything to do with such a policy?
No, I don't.
As the Principal Private Secretary, is that a matter with which you would have been concerned?
I would have been aware of the policy statement, I'm sure, but I cannot remember the substance. And I imagine our policy on WhatsApps, certainly throughout this period, was in a sense the same as our policy on other material, which was around retention of WhatsApps or messages which were important for the decision-making process, but not the ephemeral side of things.
Could you just go a little bit slower, please, Mr. Reynolds, whilst you give evidence? It's very hard for our stenographers to keep up with the speed of your evidence. So you say there was material relating to decision-making and WhatsApp material relating to more ephemeral matters. Mm-hmm. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think in this period, I think there is a significant shift in the volume of WhatsApps which were used for discussions, reflecting the shift to remote working and the pace of some of the activities going on with people in different locations. And so certainly my experience was WhatsApp became more extensive in its usage than certainly I had experienced previously.
But that is to do with the volume. What is this distinction that you draw between WhatsApps relating to decision-making and more ephemeral WhatsApps? What are ephemeral WhatsApps?
I think that certainly from my experience of the WhatsApps that I have seen, the vast majority of those WhatsApps were of an ephemeral nature, and that decisions when they took place were taking place in the normal way and recorded in the normal way. And a lot of the WhatsApps you are seeing, it seems to me, are exchanges which people could have been doing previously by telephone or in corridors or things like that. They are now just recorded in WhatsApp, but are ephemeral in nature, in the same way as if there's a conversation about a policy matter before people go into a substantive discussion in the corridor where someone might say something to me or to others. We're not necessarily recording all of that because it's ephemeral in nature. Where the decision takes place and the process leading to that decision are recorded in a normal way.
You're not suggesting, are you, that the vast majority of these COVID-related WhatsApps are irrelevant?
No, I think they're relevant to the COVID inquiry, but in terms of the decision-making process and the obligation on civil servants to record formally steps in the decision-making process, it's a bit different.
So I'm not following, why aren't they part of the decision-making process?
Because I suppose in any decision, there is all sorts of ephemeral discussions around a policy. Not all of those discussions are recorded in full, even in the main meetings themselves.
But, Mr. Reynolds, they are all relevant, are they not, to the state of mind of the sender and indirectly the recipient? Mm-hmm. They are all relevant to the debate about COVID and the decisions which were then being taken, are they not?
That is correct, and that is why I retained all of my WhatsApps, and I handed over my WhatsApps to the inquiry in full.
And that presumably was because you were aware from a very early stage that your WhatsApps would be relevant to any inquiry that might thereafter take place, as well as to perhaps lessons learned exercises, as well as providing a contemporaneous understanding of the thinking of the persons who sent and received WhatsApps.
Correct.
Yes. You were aware, were you not, that the WhatsApps from the core decision makers and advisors would all become relevant in due course?
Yes.
Could we have 265619, page 68, please? This is a WhatsApp message between yourself and Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, in December 2021, so later this year, where after a debate about the general mood and the way in which matters are progressing, particularly on the Omicron front, because this is December 2021. Towards the bottom of the page, Simon Case, PM is mad if he doesn't think his WhatsApps will become public via COVID inquiry, but he was clearly not in the mood for that discussion tonight. We'll have that battle in the new year. Martin Reynolds, that is, of course, you, agree. Thanks for your help. What was the battle about, Mr. Reynolds?
I cannot recall, but I imagine that the Prime Minister, I'm afraid I can only speculate, but I imagine he hadn't realised that all of his WhatsApps would become public via the COVID inquiry.
Because, of course, as the then Prime Minister, his WhatsApps would form a vital part of a full, transparent examination of the decision-making at the time.
Yes.
As yours would.
Yes.
Yes. When was it first understood in number 10 Downing Street that there might be a public inquiry?
I'm afraid I cannot recall. But I think in certainly the early stages, I and others were not thinking in those terms. I mean, certainly in the very sort of pressured period of early 2020, I don't think I was really reflecting on whether there would be a public inquiry. I was much more focused on dealing with the day-to-day challenges at that time. So I would have thought it would be after that, but how far after that I cannot comment.
You will know from the disclosure, Mr. Reynolds, that Sir Patrick Vallance's evening notes, his diaries, as well as some other notebooks and emails disclosed in the inquiry, show that the notion of there being a public inquiry first appeared in the general discourse around about the end of 2020, in the beginning of 2021. Does that sound right to you?
That sounds entirely plausible.
We've already seen an entry in the notes of Sir Patrick Vallance in which he records the Cabinet Secretary, Simon Case, as saying that any inquiry should go on for a decade or more, want someone like Savile to chair it and keep it going forever, and that's dated the 3rd of November 2020. Did you take part in any debate about the nature or the extent or the time of an inquiry?
I was involved in the discussions which the Prime Minister had about the nature of an inquiry, but I don't think, comment on that particular exchange.
The then Prime Minister made an announcement to Parliament on the 12th of May 2021. Could we have that, please, on the screen? 273904. And then to the second page, please. Mr. Speaker, with permission, I will update the House in our response to COVID. And then if you could scroll through, please, to the next page. The state has an obligation to examine its actions as rigorously and candidly as possible and to learn every lesson for the future, which is why I've always said that when the time is right, there should be a full and independent inquiry. And he announces, does he not, therefore the institution of that inquiry. And then further down the page, a reference to consulting with the devolved administrations. And then over one more page, please. He refers to the exercise of identifying and disclosing all relevant information, the burden that that will place on the participants. And then further down the page and over the page. He says this in the bottom 6 entries. This inquiry must be able to look at the events of the last year in the cold light of day and identify the key issues that will make a difference for the future, free to scrutinise every document. As the Principal Private Secretary, presumably you had a hand in advising the Prime Minister and assisting in the process by which the Prime Minister decided that there would be a public inquiry and that it would be announced to Parliament. Do you recall that process, Mr. Reynolds?
I think the process was actually on the basis of advice from the Cabinet Office and discussions with the Cabinet Office team. So I was present for that discussion, or may well have been present for elements of that discussion, but I was not responsible for the advice and the process through which it came to that conclusion.
You knew, did you not, that the Prime Minister was considering instituting a public inquiry and that that would be announced to Parliament?
Mm-hmm.
If yes, please
yes,
say so.
Yes.
And presumably that process by which the announcement was drafted and by which the decision was made to have a public inquiry took a matter of weeks. Presumably these decisions aren't just made on the spot.
No, it was probably longer than weeks.
So at least before April of that year,
mm-hmm.
If this was May 2021, at least a month.
Yeah.
You were party to a WhatsApp group called PM Updates, were you not?
Yes.
Could we have 265631? PM Updates from Martin Reynolds' phone. It's a group that was formed on the 16th of November 2020, was it not?
Yes.
You created group PM Updates. Is you, Martin Reynolds?
It is indeed, yes.
At 2017 on that day, you said, I've created a new group to focus on updates, diary, etc. from the outer office. And I think in that group were the Prime Minister, yourself, Cleo Watson, Stuart Glassborough, Henry Cook and Dan Rosenfield, all the Prime Minister's closest advisors.
Mm-hmm.
This was no doubt a hugely important WhatsApp group.
If I can explain the PM update system, that might sort of give you a better sense of actually its importance, which is that we had throughout most of this time a system of updating, of giving the Prime Minister updates on factual developments, on quick decisions he might need to be taking, and that was done initially in paper copy. The PM Updates group essentially translated that paper copy into WhatsApp, but it remained, unlike almost any other WhatsApp group, basically on email and hard copy. So what you had was, as it were, parallel structures where what I would do is I was sent an email with the updates for the day on. I would put it onto a WhatsApp and send it to the Prime Minister, and then I would take it back from the Prime Minister and send an email out with his record on it. And so, unlike the other WhatsApp groups we will no doubt want to talk about, it was actually a mechanistic way of delivering to the Prime Minister unclassified material which he could look at, as it were, at an appropriate time each evening, and it was done on a daily basis. But actually, the chain of record keeping was all done through email or hard copy and back out again. So essentially what you're seeing here is the central bit in the process where something goes to the Prime Minister by WhatsApp and is sent back again. And so what I was doing there was, as it were, acting as a way of transmitting that to the Prime Minister. But in terms of the substance of the decisions, some were fairly low level, and some were quite mechanistic, as could be questions about who he wanted to see or things like that.
You're not suggesting that this WhatsApp group was anything other than highly relevant to the information that the Prime Minister was receiving. It deals with matters such as parliamentary business and the dealing with the COVID pandemic. face-to-face conversations as well as multiple WhatsApp groups. But the detail was not being replicated elsewhere. You weren't cut and pasting other documents into this WhatsApp group, were you?
I was, yes.
In entirety?
Yes. And I was then responding by email, and that's why it's different from the other WhatsApp groups I'm in. So you can see at least, yes, I mean, I'm not typing these texts into the WhatsApp itself. I'm literally receiving it onto my phone, cutting and pasting it, sending it to the Prime Minister, and then taking his response and sending it out again.
Why would you need to cut and paste everything from an email into a separate WhatsApp group?
Well, I mean, in a sense, it's something it's something actually I introduced with Philip Hammond. Right? It's a way of distilling paperwork to a minister, reducing and boiling it down in a way which means it is readily comprehensible. So rather than lots and lots of separate box returns or billet doux or whatever, what you do is you distill it into one document, normally of 2 or 3 sides, and then the minister can read through quite quickly every day a whole bunch of updates and other things so it can be updated in an efficient way. Reducing and boiling it down in a way which means it is readily comprehensible. So rather than lots and lots of separate box returns or billet doux or whatever, what you do is you distill it into one document, normally of 2 or 3 sides, and then the minister can read through quite quickly every day a whole bunch of updates and other things so it can be updated in an efficient way. This is, as it were, an evolution of that, which I think reflected the Prime Minister's desire to receive it on WhatsApp rather than in hard copy, so he could get that information and respond at whatever time was convenient for him, overnight or early in the morning or whenever it might be. So it's a bit different from a normal WhatsApp where I might be typing in a message.
Well, let's have a look at page 16 and 17, pages 16 and 17, which are good indications of the sort of information that you were providing. In the middle of the page, generate speaking to Starmer, Ray Liverpool, Ben Ed, and I all think a good idea, but just to be advised, is it?
Yeah, to be aware.
To be aware. Netanyahu, the Premier of Israel, has asked for an urgent call re vaccines. We've declined. You then talk about the commercial evictions moratorium, and over the page 17. Vaccine deployment, parliamentary affairs, information about the ECB. Are you saying all this was cut and pasted from other emails which you
I would need to check but I did not type all of those in as WhatsApps, no. Now, right. Some of those emails, some of those messages, you are right, may have been things I'd added in. Right. But if you look at the majority of that you're looking at, that is all stuff which has been cut and pasted. So, for example, on the screen, the Cabinet Secretary has signed off the following agenda. That is literally cut and pasted from a document I've been sent. Similarly, the ECB announcement, that's literally cut and pasted. So essentially, it's a transmission mechanism. It's different from most other WhatsApps. That isn't to say that some of the responses on there might have been typed in manually, but looking at this list, the vast majority, if not all, have been cut and pasted. And there'll be documents in number 10 which will literally have daily update 10th of December with all of these things in, and there'll be an email to me with it, an email out with it, where I explain the Prime Minister has noted all these issues.
But not all of it, you would agree, Mr. Reynolds. Some of the information appears only in these WhatsApp threads, correct?
I think some, possibly, but I'd need to check it off. And I think the other thing I would say is it comes back to my point about ephemeral and non-ephemeral. What's actually been recorded here is the flow of update material into the Prime Minister, which is read out again by email.
Mr. Reynolds, all this material is directly relevant, is it not, to the management of the COVID pandemic? Whether it's to do with his business in Parliament, or in government, or in Number 10, or Downing Street, or how the government generally is responding. It's all to do with COVID, isn't it? The material that we have not redacted on the basis it's irrelevant and sensitive. Correct?
Yes.
Right. Could we have page 114, please? On the 15th of April of 2021, So just a matter of a few weeks before Mr. Johnson announced the public inquiry to Parliament, you turned on the disappearing message function in this WhatsApp group. New messages will disappear from this chat 7 days after they're sent. And if we look at the bottom of the page, August 2021, and then over the page to 115, it's obvious from the people who joined and left that the WhatsApp group continued.
Yes.
Until you left on the 20th of March 2022. So you were plainly discussing COVID-related matters between the moment you turned the disappearing function on to March 2022 when you left. Correct?
Yes.
Why did you turn on the disappearing message function around the time that the Prime Minister announced a public inquiry into the COVID pandemic?
I cannot. I mean, I can guess or I can speculate, but I cannot recall exactly why I did so. But as I say, my explanation is this WhatsApp group was very different from any other WhatsApp group on my phone in that it was essentially funneling information into the Prime Minister and out, and all of that was recorded separately in hard copy or in email form, including the Prime Minister's comments. So that flow of information of updating him on developments was recorded properly on our systems. Now, I can speculate as to why I might have done it. As I said at the start, I've kept all my other WhatsApps for the relevant period and handed them over. So I don't believe it was intended to prevent the inquiry from having sight of this. It could, for example, have been because I was worried of someone screenshotting or using some of the exchanges and leaking them.
Well, these are your closest colleagues, and you had obviously been engaging with them in this WhatsApp group for many, many months. In fact, from 16th of November 2020 until April 21, correct?
Yes.
There was no change in the number 10 system whereby emails were being sent to the Prime Minister and notes were being put into his red box, were there, around April?
No.
So it wasn't that the system had changed, requiring you to no longer engage in this WhatsApp communication. You just turned on the disappearing function.
Correct. But I didn't. I mean, again, I think I see what you're pushing at, but I didn't put disappearing function on any of my other WhatsApps, and the rationale for doing this is unclear to me, and I cannot remember that far out. But as I say, the PM Updates WhatsApp group was based on a formal sort of flow of paperwork, and so arguably all of that material is still available to the inquiry.
This WhatsApp group is not available because the disappearing function was turned on by you in April 2021.
Correct.
Right. Could we now then look, please, for a moment at the structure and the structure number 10 and your role as the Principal Private Secretary? You were, in essence, the Director General of Downing Street, were you not? You were essentially the head of the private office and responsible for the management of number 10 as a corporate entity.
Correct. Would it be helpful if I just explained the different elements in number 10 and tried to show how number 10 worked in its sort of slightly strange hybrid political and civil service way?
Would you mind terribly, Mr. Reynolds, if I just ask the questions, and if you feel that there is evidence that you wish to give about the role of 10 Downing Street, then you can answer appropriately. In Downing Street, there were obviously a number of very important but different moving parts. There's yourself as the Principal Private Secretary. There is the civil service element. There are other private secretaries. Mm-hmm. There is the Cabinet Secretary, who of course is, as it says on the tin, the Secretary to the Cabinet, a member of the civil service, but also advisors to the Prime Minister, who were not themselves civil servants. Is that correct?
Correct.
And, for example, they included Mr. Dominic Cummings.
Correct.
To what extent, Mr. Reynolds, were you, as the head of the private office, as the principal private secretary, responsible for keeping the Prime Minister informed as to what was going on? Was it a function that you exclusively held, or was it a function held alongside other civil servants, or was it a divided function, that is to say, between the civil service and Mr. Cummings and his group of advisors?
The role of the private office, which is a team of about 20 people, it essentially manages the Prime Minister's day-to-day professional existence. So its role is to manage the flow of papers between the government machine and the Prime Minister, to organise the meetings which people are requesting and trying to put those in the diary at the right time, right period of time, and all of those sorts of issues. So it's a running the professional existence of the Prime Minister and linking back into the government machine, both in the Cabinet Office, where the Cabinet Secretary is the lead official, and out into departments. So it is acting, as it were, as connective tissue between the government machine and the Prime Minister.
Was there anybody higher than you in terms of civil service appointment? Did you answer to anybody, for example, the Cabinet Secretary, or are you the senior official in Downing Street?
I am the senior DG in Downing Street, but the Cabinet Secretary is my line manager. And he, in fact, both Mark Sebel and Simon Case are in Downing Street the whole time. And so it's a slightly fluid sort of interplay between the Cabinet Secretary and Downing Street.
I think you attended all the important meetings in relation to those areas of policy for which you were primarily responsible. Is that because there were areas of policy that you particularly focused on, as opposed to your other private secretaries, the other private secretaries in Downing Street?
I mean, I didn't really have a core policy responsibility. So, and different private secretaries manage their relationship differently. So some principal private secretaries would have a policy responsibility, but I only dealt with, I suppose, as a core policy responsibility, some of the most sensitive intelligence issues which didn't go to other people. And you have a team of private secretaries who are covering each of the policy areas. And so for the purposes of COVID, you have Imran Shafi, who I think you are seeing after me, and his role was covering the public services, so he would cover all the policy issues in his area and would be the person who would be, as it were, managing the flow of papers in that area, managing updates, keeping the Prime Minister abreast of things. I had a slightly broader remit where I was essentially leading the private office as a collective entity, managing the relationship with the Cabinet Office. I also did a number of sort of slightly more bespoke things, like managing the relationship with the palace, and I also oversaw the overall administration of the building, which in the COVID period becomes much more significant.
Of course.
So I have a wider set of responsibilities. I look across the full set of policy issues, but the individual private secretaries, who are each extremely talented and tend to have a background in the issues they're working on, were the people who were leading the issue within Downing Street and basically acting as that connective tissue, even if I was then in some of the meetings.
The material shows, Mr. Reynolds, that you debated COVID at great length in the WhatsApp groups to which you were a member, that you attended a huge number of meetings with the Prime Minister in relation to COVID. You were privy to the debates before Cobra, the debate in Cabinet about COVID. You essentially tracked what was going on, did you not?
In reality, I think Stuart Glassborough and Imran Shafi were much more into the detail of exactly what was happening on COVID. And I was indeed present for many of the discussions. but that was to get a broad overview of what is going on. The decision-making processes, the detail of what is happening, was being tracked in much more detail by Stuart and Imran.
You must have debated the vital decisions that were being taken in the course of the COVID pandemic with the Prime Minister and his closest advisors. You were his principal private secretary, were you not?
The closest decisions, I mean, it seems to me on COVID, you had world experts who were advising on how to handle issues. My job was to try and make sure that the private office machine was underpinning, making sure that the decisions which needed to go to the Prime Minister, the meetings, and all the sort of arrangements around the processes were there to enable the Prime Minister to get the best possible advice from the real experts on COVID and to hear from his ministers or other political advisors some of the political dynamics around those decisions. I was not, if that is what you are suggesting, there to give the Prime Minister advice on COVID, and would have felt very uncomfortable to be someone who was, as it were, taking a position against the expert advice of Chris Whitty or Patrick Vallance, or indeed the Cabinet Secretary or some of the other figures there. So it's a very, you have a lot of key players who are providing advice to the Prime Minister. The role of the private office very often is around choreography and making sure the right people are there at the right time, managing the processes around the Prime Minister, so preparing for press conferences, preparing for parliamentary statements. So it's the organisational underpinning for what is going on, but the actual advice to the Prime Minister came from others.
You sent notes to the Prime Minister, which were put into his red box, concerning developments in relation to the COVID pandemic, did you not?
Correct.
Did you send emails to the Prime Minister and others expressing your views as to what should be done about the many complex features of the COVID pandemic?
I don't recall giving advice on the substance of COVID. Now, the role of the private secretary is to enable the flow of information from the department or from the Cabinet Office or from other parts of the government system to the Prime Minister and out again, to make sure that that moves quickly and that to some extent there is an efficient process for managing that. In terms of expressing my views on COVID, I don't believe I did on a regular basis, and I certainly wouldn't have done so formally. I think what we're doing, I imagine we'll want to come back to the different phases in the pandemic, but a lot of what I was doing, certainly in the sort of crisis phase, is making sure that the private secretaries are structured and able to pick up the various strands of activity coming out of meetings, to drive that through the system and to bring it back to the Prime Minister and to others for meetings.
Imran Shafi'i was a private secretary and you were his line manager because you're the principal private secretary. He, of course, gave advice to the Prime Minister regularly, repeatedly in relation to aspects of COVID.
He's regularly giving exactly steers, but I was not leading on COVID. I was not. I was making sure that the overall machine and the processes were working, and I was not in the detail, and so not able to give advice in the same way as Imran, or indeed Stuart Glassborough. Stuart Glassborough, yes.
You're aware that Mr. Cummings, in his statement to this inquiry, suggests that you are too deferential to the Prime Minister and shied away from confronting him with hard issues. What do you say to that?
I think, well, I imagine as part of our evidence, we'll come back to the departure arrangements for Mark Sedwill. I think on a number of occasions where I felt it was necessary and I needed to step in, I gave the Prime Minister very clear advice when I disagreed with him. But those were on issues where I felt it was my role as the principal private secretary to step in and give that advice. And I can identify 3 or 4 such examples if that would be helpful.
Your position is that those all related, however, to the organisational aspects of number 10, to the role by which advice was given by others, how the system worked to support the Prime Minister, in essence.
Correct.
Tell us then, please, whether there is any basis to the suggestion also made by Mr. Cummings that in February and March of 2020, there was an untoward degree of optimism bias on the part of the Prime Minister, a sense of, well, the worst is not going to happen. We may be overreacting here. It could be swine flu. There's nothing to see here, or not too much to see here. Is there any basis for that suggestion?
Well, I think if you look at the paperwork through from January, February, March, well, actually till late February, while there are clearly reports coming in identifying some of the risks and challenges around COVID, the tone of those communications, which I imagine we may want to come back to, was very much that the system was tracking this very carefully, the right processes were in place to manage that, and that whilst there were potentially large challenges ahead, that in a sense the plans and the preparations were broadly in place. And I think there was a sort of reassuring message coming up into number 10 during that period. Now, in terms of the Prime Minister's perspective, I think he is instinctively optimistic, but I also think that he instinctively believes that as a leader, it's important to project confidence and ability to deal with things. But I think that the suggestion you're making is one which is shared not just, as it were, by the Prime Minister, but across the centre of government more generally. That in a sense, that this is a worrying pandemic in China. It was being tracked quite closely, and the preparations were in place to deal with it if necessary.
The secret's in the word bias. The suggestion is that there was a degree of optimism bias. That is to say that the sunny outlook adopted by the Prime Minister and perhaps by others in government was not justified by the developing reality, by the objective state of facts.
I think your inquiry will be better able to verify that than I can.
You were Mr. Johnson's principal private secretary. You must have formed a view in February and March as to whether or not the government was getting on top of the problem with sufficient alacrity, sufficient speed, and attention to detail.
I think, well, from the paperwork certainly I have here, at the end of February there is a note to the Prime Minister setting out, as it were, the assessment of the challenges that COVID presented, and that note is produced by a group of the most senior advisors on the issue, plus the director of the Civil Contingency Secretariat, and that note I can see does seem to be pretty, I wouldn't say reassuring, but gives the sense that the system is gripping the challenge in an appropriate way. And I recognise that after that, within about 2 or 3 weeks period, the government is looking at very fundamental interventions. But I would just observe that many of those interventions were not highlighted or identified in the note at the end of February. So, I mean, I agree that, you know, with the benefit of hindsight, it does appear that we should have been far more vigorously looking and testing our arrangements for what was coming, and that would arguably have made a big difference when the crisis hit.
You're referring to a note to the Prime Minister on the 28th of February, and we'll come back to that in due course. Mm-hmm. What about before the end of February, though, Mr. Reynolds? And putting aside hindsight, it was apparent, wasn't it, by the middle of February, that there was sustained human-to-human transmission in the community in the United Kingdom, correct?
Correct.
It was obvious because SAGE and through the CMO and the CSA, the government, SAGE had advised, and through the CMO and the CSA, the government was aware that the ability of the state to be able to control the spread of the virus was very much weakened. It was plain that there would be very real difficulties in controlling the spread of the virus, correct?
I defer to your judgment.
Well,
I mean, I haven't got the record in front of me, but
do you recall
I recall the flow of information highlighting the growing problem of COVID in terms of, actually the assessment of what that means and what the reality means in terms of the UK government response. That, in a sense, is not the responsibility of the PPS. That was, you would expect advice to be coming in saying, as we found out 2 or 3 weeks later, that we're not prepared to deal with X, Y, or Z, and we need to address it very quickly.
Mr. Reynolds, you sat in on those meetings with the Prime Minister in early, middle and late February, did you not?
Yes.
You sent emails about COVID and received emails about COVID in the early part and the middle part and late part of February, did you not?
Correct.
So you must have formed a view as to what the level of the crisis was and whether or not, in fact, the absence of means to control the virus, the fact that it had already started to spread in the United Kingdom, presented the government with an alarming conundrum, with a terrible prospect, correct?
Correct.
So why was it, to use your words, only at the end of February that the government machine, to paraphrase your evidence, proceeded to deal with this crisis, to deal with the problem, which was already then apparent?
Well, as I say, I mean, I think the evidence from what you're saying seems to suggest that we should have been assessing the situation differently and moving more quickly. But that certainly, from the as I say, from the note at the end of February, the overall sense was the relevant parts of government were already, as it were, looking over exactly what needed to be done in preparations. And the overall message was that while there are some difficult decisions, or there will be some difficult decisions to be taken, the government machine is prepared for that eventuality.
You have a great deal of experience, of course, in the civil service with the management of government. It's what you do. To what extent was Mr. Johnson's administration in January and February of 2020 an inexperienced one or a new one or one that might, because of the novelty, and of course the general election had only taken place a few months before, that perhaps it was unable structurally to be able to cope with a crisis of this magnitude?
Well, I think it is fair to say that the dynamics in January, February, March of 2020 were very different to the dynamics before the election. Obviously, the majority was very different, but there had been a very big shift in overall focus pre-election on Brexit and the Brexit negotiations, and that had been pretty, well, it had been the overriding focus of that entire period for 3 or 4 months, and that had been concluded. The election had happened, and it did feel like there was a significant, as it were, turning of the page, because with a majority of 80 or whatever it was, there was a sense that the government had a 5 or 10 year time horizon to look at, and there was a really strong focus on the forward agenda. So at the beginning of January, there was an away day in Chequers, which I attended. There was some work around what I would view as being sort of completing Brexit, not masses, but it was around closing down the Department for exiting the European Union. There were some very big decisions around HS2, big decisions around 5G and the rollout of 5G technology across the UK. And so there was, as it were, a very different feel to Downing Street, a very different feel to the centre of government as we were trying to get used to what this new political reality meant.
And
I think, if I may
yes,
continue,
please.
The other thing I would say within Downing Street specifically was we were getting used to a slightly divergent internal politics because it was increasingly clear that the Prime Minister's and Dominic Cummings's agendas were not overlapping or were overlapped in part, but were quite different. And that, in that period, meant that we were starting to try and work out what are the priorities, how do we deliver this, and what are we, in a sense, what are we trying to achieve as a collective? And that dynamic, I think, was starting to become more prominent. The other dynamic, I would say, during this period is a sort of unease with some of the messaging and actions taking place. So it was during this period that we were talking about the appointment of various, and I use quotes here, weirdos and misfits, and bringing in very different people into Downing Street. And we had the case of Mr. Sabisky, who you remember is a advisor brought in who had unusual views on eugenics, and after 3 days he resigned. There was a lot of work going on around a possible reorganisation of Number 10 because we were considering relocating the Prime Minister's office to a different part of the building. So a lot of work was going on that, and there was, I think, quite a bit of unease in the civil service around, and I excuse my language, the so-called shit list of people who were thought to be at risk in what was perceived to be a potentially more muscular approach to the civil service. So I think it is fair to say, in the period you're talking about, there were quite a lot of other things taking place, which meant that quite a bit of senior energy and attention was focusing on other things.
I'm just going to pause you there, please, Mr. Reynolds. It's a very long answer. The dynamic between Mr. Cummings and the Prime Minister, of course, changed during the course of the year, did it not? And in the end, Mr. Cummings left at the end of 2020. But that dynamic, was that a major feature of any instability in Downing Street in that early period, January, February, which is what I'm concerned about?
I think the dynamic, I mean, there is an unusual dynamic around Dominic Cummings in that, in many ways, in my view, he was the most empowered Chief of Staff Downing Street has seen, and was the person whose writ ruled and was able to drive things through the machine in a way I suspect few other Chiefs of Staff have done. But what I would also say is that the Prime Minister at the time did not work exclusively on the basis of advice of his Chief of Staff, and that if you look at many of the policy debates going on, he was looking to other advisors within Number 10 to express their views, and he liked, as it were, a multiplicity of different arguments and advice from which he could choose. And I think a particularly important political advisor in this context was Ed Lister, who would often give a very different assessment or perspective on many of the core issues, reflecting his role or his previous roles in local government and in business. And so whilst you're right, there is a sort of very clear political direction, there are the two bits of confusion I would add to that. One is that Dominic Cummings isn't, like most previous Chiefs of Staff, always pursuing the same agenda as the Prime Minister, and that the Prime Minister himself is looking to hear divergent views. And HS2 is a good example of that.
Mr. Reynolds, I'm going to pull you back from a debate about HS2. My question asked you what the position was in Downing Street in January and February. The dynamic between Mr. Cummings and the Prime Minister did not begin to deteriorate until later in the year. The reorganisation, in particular, the introduction of a new Director General, a Permanent Secretary in Number 10, and the setting up of COVID-S and COVID-O and Lord Sedwell's departure was all later in the year, predominantly from May onwards. And the other matters of which you've spoken, with the exception of Mr. Cummings' appeal for weirdos and misfits, were all later in the year. I want to ask you, what was the state of play, the ability of Number 10 to function efficiently in February, when these momentous decisions were started to be taken?
I think is what I'm saying is we're in a process of bedding into a new reality, and whilst you're right that the relationship between Dominic Cummings and the Prime Minister was very good at this stage, but I do think it's relevant as to how he operates even when the relationship is very good, and as it were, the approach which relies on multiple sources of debate and information, and the fact that you have a misalignment between the Prime Minister and the Chief of Staff in terms of what they're trying to achieve.
But it wasn't just Mr. Cummings, was it, Mr. Reynolds? It's not. Are you suggesting that any lack of efficiency or efficacy in Downing Street was solely the responsibility of Mr. Cummings?
Not at all, no. And I wouldn't wish to be suggesting that at all. But what I'm trying to suggest is that in this period, we're getting used to a different type of working arrangement to what we were experiencing, as it were, before the general election. And I'm not saying that, I'm not looking to, as it were, to blame, or I'm just trying to give a sense of a bedding down of a new operation where people are trying to work out how this new reality works, what the priorities are, how we manage the different personalities, and all of those sorts of things. And I think it does have an impact into the mood and the nature of Number 10 at this early period.
You are aware, of course, that Sir Patrick Vallance, who played an extraordinarily important part in the response to the pandemic and was the liaison, of course, along with Professor Sir Chris Whitty, between SAGE and the government, has described the position in Number 10. On one occasion, on the 5th of April, he says, Number 10, chaos as usual. In June, his notes refer to the fact that no one in Number 10 or the Cabinet Office had really read or taken time to understand science advice. He says it's quite extraordinary. And he remarks, albeit later in the year, that Simon Case, the Cabinet Secretary, had reported to him that Number 10 was at war with itself. Would you agree that there was an unusual degree of chaos, dysfunctionality, lack of efficiency in Number 10 during those early important months?
I think that in the early months, there is a bedding down of a new working arrangement. So if we're talking about January, February, and probably the early bit of March, we are, in my view, bedding down new arrangements. But the flow of information into Number 10, which you will no doubt hear from Imran Shafi and others, the actual work process and so forth, are, I think, managing in the normal way.
All right.
What I would like, if I may, at some point, Milady, is just to talk you through what happens when we go into crisis, because I noticed that the comment you ascribed to Patrick Vallance was in early April. And I think it's important, as I'm sure you do, but it might be helpful to you if I explain what happens when an organisation like Downing Street, or at least when the government goes into crisis, and how that impacts on our operations.
Well, if I may venture to speak for Milady, we will be getting there.
Fine. Okay.
The Cabinet Office, it is plain, formed an absolutely crucial part of the government's response, because the crisis machinery, geographically, institutionally, is within the Cabinet Office, and plainly there has to be the closest working relationships between the Cabinet Office and Number 10 in order to respond properly to a crisis. Would you agree?
Correct.
There is evidence, both from Mr. Alex Thomas, who gave evidence to this inquiry, and from Mr. Cummings's statement, and of course we'll be hearing from him tomorrow, that the Cabinet Office had huge numbers of unnecessary staff. It was bloated, he says, particularly at senior level, with poor responsibility. There was a lack of clarity around the decision-making processes. It couldn't drive priorities or fix problems with departments. That, in essence, it failed to be able to drive the crisis machinery forward again in those crucial early months. Would you agree?
In a sense, Mr. Keith, that's the same point I would make about the shift from. I mean, it seems to me you've got a period, probably January, February, where it's normal activity, as it were. You have a crisis machinery, tracking a crisis in China, and they are feeding that information into Number 10, and that is, as it were, the process underway at that stage. And as you've highlighted, you can argue, and I think I would agree, that we were not sufficiently quick at identifying the scale of the problem and of road testing the plans and preparations we had in place. But I think that is a different question to what then happens when we shift into crisis. And I think some of the criticisms you're alleging of the Cabinet Office relate really to that period when we go into crisis.
But they are systemic issues, are they not? And whether or not it's appropriate to divide up a chronology or a reaction or a response by way of evidence gathering stage, response stage, do something stage. What is suggested by Mr. Cummings and others is that the system in the Cabinet Office was not working well. Its staffing levels and organisation were inefficient. It was unable systemically to be able to drive priorities or solve problems between other government departments. It was incapable functionally of responding well to a crisis. That is the suggestion. Do you agree?
I think there are organisational challenges within the Cabinet Office, and I do think that there are many things which could have been done differently. But I think, again, the real challenge for the Cabinet Office at this stage, in my view, is that it didn't have the plans and processes in place to move from the early stage through to the crisis stage and manage it in the way a normal crisis would be managed. And of course, the flip side of that is the scale of COVID is so big that if you have a very big pandemic, once in a generation crisis, and you don't have the right plans in place, then of course the machinery starts to find it very, very difficult to function. But I think your underlying question is, are there, on top of that, additional inefficiencies in the Cabinet Office? And the answer is yes.
Mr. Reynolds, I'd invite you to speak plainly, if I may be so bold. If the plans and processes were not there within the department that is responsible for crisis machinery, if it's not good enough, the way in which it responded, if there were many challenges organisationally, then the Cabinet Office essentially failed to do what it was required to do in the face of the pandemic.
I think it goes, I mean, in terms of the plans and procedures, I mean, it's why, in a sense, I think it is worth looking at the whole crisis response. It seems to me the plans and procedures were not in place at the departmental level. It seems to me you have to look at every single level of crisis planning. In a normal crisis, the department is the department which leads the crisis, and the plans were manifestly not sufficiently developed at the departmental level. That then leads into the Cabinet Office level, where I agree with you that there are not the sufficient plans and processes in place. And so at every level, I agree with you, there are challenges.
The other government departments failed perhaps in other different ways, but the Cabinet Office, whose prime responsibility is to broker between departments, to pursue the whole government approach, to operate the crisis machinery, failed to get on top of this problem, did it not?
Correct.
Right. And the problems with the Cabinet Office continued, did they not, after February, March? Because, as you know, again, very well, WhatsApps between Mr. Cummings and Mr. Johnson, and emails, in fact, between you and Helen McNamara and Tom Shinner and others, make absolutely plain that the Cabinet Office, quote, doesn't work for anyone. It's high friction, low trust, low performance, that there was institutional friction between Number 10 and the Cabinet Office, and to use Mr. Johnson's words, the Cabinet Secretary was miles off pace. Those were all problems that continued after February, March, did they not?
I would almost, with the greatest of respect, I would almost flip that. That the problems become very manifest in March, April, because essentially a government machine which is configured for certain types of crisis is confronting a crisis of a magnitude larger, and the processes at the departmental level, at the and at the Cabinet Office level are inadequate to deal with them. So the challenges in the crisis response become much more evident at that stage.
So the failures, if that is what Milady concludes they were manifest across the board, because there was a failure of the government departments to produce plans and to get on top of the problems for which they were responsible, and a failure by the Cabinet Office to manage the crisis at the core of government.
Yes, I mean, that is why I do wonder whether it might be helpful to set out how I think a crisis works,
well,
and how the different strands fit together.
Forgive me, I'm going to show you your own emails just in a moment, Mr. Reynolds. You'll have to restrain yourself until we see them. The very experienced civil servant Helen McNamara, who of course you know, has said in her statement that there were collective concerns that wrong people were in the room, and so the Prime Minister was not being given sufficiently expert policy advice. Would you agree?
Yes, at times.
Were there concerns between Number 10 and the Cabinet Office regarding the clarity about who was leading in which areas?
Yes.
Was it clear that structures across government were struggling to cope with the demands that they faced, both inside the Cabinet Office and across the centre of government?
Yes.
And so we may be clear then, Mr. Reynolds, that was the position structurally within Number 10 and the Cabinet Office on the cusp of the pandemic, and when you all collectively first became aware of the problem emanating from China?
I'm not sure in terms of the timing of that. I think, as I say, there is a difference between the period before the crisis and the shift into crisis, where the situation gets dramatically worse. So some of the elements you may be talking about participation in meetings and so forth, may well be correct throughout the January-February period. But where the machine really struggles is when we shift into full crisis mode, where the fact we haven't got, as it were, plans means that and I can talk you through some of the responses, but the situation becomes extremely complicated and very high friction indeed, and that clearly makes a management of the crisis very difficult.
Are you essentially saying the machine was poor structurally, but it became even worse as the weeks
I think the machine was not properly prepared for the scale of the crisis it was about to face, and that whereas the machine would have been prepared to deal with the sort of crises it had dealt with previously, And if you look at, I don't know, I'm from the Foreign Office, so if you look at an evacuation from Afghanistan or from Lebanon, or those sorts of, as it were, segmented crises which involve a relatively small number of government departments, the machine is equipped to deal with that, and I think it deals with it relatively efficiently, even if there are always bound to be ways of you improve it. The difference in this case is, rather than a segmented crisis, which is covering 4 or 5 different government departments, you've got a whole of government crisis, which means every government department is dealing with a major departmental set of issues for which many of them were not properly prepared. That then feeds into a Cabinet Office set of structures which were not designed to manage a whole of government crisis in that nature. And that is what I think you're seeing in early March through to indeed the piece of work that Helen McNamara and I produced. I think it was in May.
It was. My lady, is that a convenient moment?
Certainly. I shall return at midday.